Let's begin preparing our hearts this evening that we're going to respond at the end of this evening and ask God to do stuff in our life, to do what only He can do in our life, whatever it is for you to do that. And here, you know, what God can do in a moment is limitless. What God could do just in a minute this evening, on an ordinary evening, on an ordinary evening service, what God could do in your life this evening is limitless. God could do something in your life that would change the whole course of your life. And you know, on Friday they buried Billy Graham. And I'm sure, like many of you, I've been reflecting and thinking about that great man and what God did through one single person's life. And I think more impressive than the eloquence of his preaching or the crowds that gathered to listen to him is the generational impact that the life of Billy Graham had. And I've been saying, Lord, could it be that my life, not that I want to be Billy Graham, but in some way you would have a generational impact through my life? Could it be that through the life of this local church, that generations to come would say, thank God for the ministry of that local church. Thank God for the ministry outworked through a person. And it's not about being a pastor or a preacher. It's about you outworking your calling and your gifting wherever you are this week. And so tonight I'm preparing you, packing your lunch, packing your bag, ready for this week so that you can step into your week and be all that God is calling you to be this week. So we're going to turn in our Bibles to Genesis 18 and just read another account of a part of Abraham's life. And I've been enjoying unpacking Abraham's life over these weeks. And so let's turn there, just one of these stories that make up Abraham's journey. Genesis 18 from verse 1. I think it's going to be on the screen. That's fantastic. Thank you. It says this: the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, if I found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may wash all your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant. Very well, they answered. Do as you say. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then bought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set them before them. And while they ate, he stood near them under a tree. Where is your wife Sarah? They asked him. There in the tent, he said. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? Then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I am old? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, I did not laugh. But he said, yes, you did laugh. This is a key turning point in the promises of Abraham, the promises of God to Abraham being outworked. This promise that he would have descendants as many as the stars in the sky and sand on the shore. And of course, we know that Sarah wasn't able to bear a child. And so this was a promise that they were standing on, but it was in faith looking impossible to them because of their age. And yet this was almost a catalyst moment where the Lord's visitation to them here, and the Lord says within a year you'll bear the child, so that the promise is about to come to fulfillment. But what I want to focus on this evening, just for a few moments to position our minds and hearts ready to respond, is Abraham's response to the visitation. How Abraham responded to these 3 men that came. And here there's not time to go into it, but essentially this is God, this is a theophany, God coming down to earth and visiting Abraham. And so there were 3 of them. You can spend the rest of the week reading about whether it was the Trinity or whether it was Jesus or whether it was God himself. You have the pleasure of doing that. But the point is that God visited Abraham. There were 3 men, maybe one of them was God, 2 of them were angels. I don't know how you split the pie, but you can find different arguments for different different viewpoints, but God visited Abraham. But it was how Abraham responded to God visiting him that created an opportunity for the miraculous to take place in Abraham's life. And I don't know whether you've noticed that throughout Abraham's story, it says God spoke to Abraham. So God would speak an oracle or a prophecy to Abraham. Abraham would hear God speak to him. And yet in this story, God visits Abraham. He could have just said this to Abraham as a prophecy. He could have spoken to him and said, Abraham, within the year, you're going to have the child that I've promised you. And yet God comes to him. And I think God came to Abraham because one of the things that God was doing is seeing what kind of welcome he would receive from Abraham. To see how Abraham would prepare and order himself to welcome God into his camp. And so God was asking and trying to see what kind of relationship he would have with Abraham, how Abraham would recognize him and welcome him. And there are some verbs, verb, a doing word. There's verbs that describe what Abraham does in this story. 4 verbs that I want to just focus on and get us thinking about this evening. What Abraham did to respond to the visitation of God in this account. See, in verse 1, it says that Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent. Verb number 1, Abraham is sitting. So, excuse me, Barry, sorry. Abraham is literally sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. And so it's hot because it's the heat of the day. And so he's sitting there, maybe enjoying the breeze, the shade, sat in the front of his tent. Here's what Abraham was doing, the normal routine things of his day. I reckon Abraham sat every single day in the heat of the day at the entrance of his tent. There was nothing special about this moment. Abraham wasn't expecting to have visitors. He's just sat like he normally would by the entrance of his tent. God breaks in and works through the normal routines of our life. That's why I love Michael's testimony there so much. He talks about, I was showing up on Sunday, I was showing up at my Connect group, I was showing up at prayer, doing the normal things, and then God broke through in his life as he positioned himself in the normal routines of his life. And so you're here this evening, maybe as a normal routine. Maybe it's not part of your normal routine to be here. Somebody's dragged you along or brought you along. But for the majority of people here, it's part of your routine to come out to church and to be here at a service. And we're in that verb, that place of sitting here. You are physically sitting, doing probably many of you in the same seat that you normally sit in, the normal routines of our life. And then these 3 visitors come. And then the next verb that we see, the next thing that Abraham did is he bowed low to the ground. Abraham sits at his tent, he sees these visitors, and he recognizes who it is. He recognizes that the Lord has visited him, and he approaches them. In fact, it says that he ran to them, or he hurried to them, and he bowed low to the ground. Probably most likely, as Ian was saying this morning, he probably put his whole body, including his face, right down on the ground and bowed down to them. This was for Abraham an act of worship. Abraham recognized who had come to visit him. I wonder if there were other people in the camp that thought, who are these 3 men that have come to visit us? Why is Abraham making such a fuss about them coming here? But Abraham recognized and he said, Lord, it's you. He understood that God had visited him. And let me tell you here, we often pray, Lord, would you be with us? Lord, would your presence come? God can't be any more with you than he is right now. God is always with you. It's the miracle of the incarnation. God has come on earth and through salvation lives within us. He can't be any more with us. But here's the crucial thing is our recognition and our awareness of his presence that we need to change. So please still pray, God, be with us. God, let your presence come, because God can't come anymore, but actually it changes our hearts and changes our minds to say, Lord, help me realize, help me be aware that your presence is here. And so Abraham recognized that God was here, and he had this recognition that this wasn't just any visitors, but God had come. And I wonder if there's some people that you've begun to take God for granted, like he's just another visitor, just somebody else that's come, and you haven't risen from the place of sitting, and you've just began to get lukewarm in your walk with God because you've become so familiar, and you've stopped recognizing the amazing, amazing truth that the God of the universe is with you. His presence is with you. And maybe you started walking into church, just another service, another time to sit and listen to a preach and see people and catch up with people. And you've forgotten that God's presence is here when we worship together. And God is here tonight. His presence is here. In fact, God couldn't be any more here than he is right now. God's presence is here with us this evening. And so in response to his recognition, the trouble with preaching in the evening is you have the morning preach, and the morning preacher says everything that you prepared to preach. And I sat there this evening scrolling stuff off, but Ian talked about it this morning, about our worship. When we have a revelation of who God is, it impacts our worship. And Abraham surrendered. What he was doing when he bowed down was surrendering his life, saying, God, you are greater than I am. And in its very essence, more than, like Ian said, the songs that we sing or the worship band that lead us, worship is an act of surrender. Romans 12, offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. This is true and proper worship, giving everything over to him. Psalm 22 says, in verse 3, it says that God is enthroned on our praises. It's almost like when we worship, we build a throne for God to come and sit on. And you understand it's poetic language because God is already on the throne. He doesn't need us to build a throne for him. But when we worship, what it does in our lives is it constructs a throne for God and it dethrones us from our own lives. Because if you're anything like me, by about 2 minutes of waking up tomorrow morning, my world would be consumed with myself and all the stuff that I got to do and everything that's going on in my world tomorrow. And when I come and worship, it reminds me that, hey, this life is not about me, but I bow down and I surrender it and I give it to God and I build a throne for him so that he's the most important one in my life. And this is what we do when we worship. It readjusts our focus on my life and my issues and puts it onto God and enthrones him in our lives, so that my temporal world in our day-to-day life, as we've come here this evening with all the things that we're going to face this week, we can become consumed with that stuff. But worship reminds us that there is a divine, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-surpassing God that is involved in our lives and already ahead of us in our weeks ahead. And so we can trust in him. So Abraham sat, but then he went and he bowed to God. The next thing that happens, and there's a few verbs involved in this moment, is that he's preparing. He's preparing. It's a funny thing. We see these verses of Abraham running around. He goes to Sarah and says, quickly, make some bread. He hurries to a servant and says to the servant, get a calf. And the servant rushes off and prepares a calf for them. And there's almost this manic moment. When you're at home and unexpected visitors, it doesn't really happen very often anymore with texts and stuff. People often text before they come, but somebody knocks at the door and suddenly you've got to prepare everything. Put away all the toys and wipe round the kitchen and those kind of things and get everything prepared. This was a last-minute moment for Abraham to get everything ready for the visitors that had come. And this was Abraham outworking hospitality. In the ancient Near East, there were some customary things that you had to do to be hospitable for people to come. But Abraham went above and beyond. He wasn't just doing the normal obligatory things that you would have to do to welcome somebody. He was going above and beyond. See, Abraham was preparing for God. He was preparing and welcoming God into his camp. And hospitality essentially is us outworking that idea of honor and worth. If we want to invite somebody round and we want to make them feel worthy and welcome in our presence, we are hospitable. We prepare food, we prepare our homes so that we're giving worth to them. And so it is in our worship, that as we give worth to God and as we worship God, the next step is for us to prepare room for him in our lives. To say, God, if you are really that great, if you are who you say you are, then I want to make room for you in my life. And so we prepare for him. Hospitality means that we're taking our eyes off ourselves, off our own issues, and giving the priority to somebody else. Putting somebody else's priority, somebody else's comfort, somebody else's needs ahead of mine. Sometimes we're so focused on ourselves that we create an inhospitable environment for God to work in our lives, because we're all about us and all about our issues, when actually if we would put our eyes onto God and say, God, what are your priorities for my life? God, what are the needs that you have? What do you want to do in my life and through my life? And so Abraham was preparing for God. Abraham prepared room for God. and created an opportunity for God to move in the supernatural way in his life. See, the next thing that happens after bringing this food to the visitors, it describes how Abraham stood near them while they ate. The fourth verb that Abraham did is that he stood. He was standing by them. And as they ate, he was waiting on them. He was waiting on them to see if there was something that they would have for him, to see what God would have for him. Abraham went from sitting in the ordinariness of his day by the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day to standing with God and expecting something miraculous. And then the promise comes to Abraham that Sarah would bear a child. You ever notice Sarah laughs and it's almost like she's never heard the news before? You know, we're thinking about this of all the times that I get in trouble because I haven't told something to Leanne. You know, Abraham has this incredible promise that Sarah will bear a child. And so it seems from the text, Abraham might have actually not mentioned this to Sarah up to this point. And it took these visitors to come and declare the promise. And Sarah overhears and she laughs about it. And there's this backwards and forwards. And God has the last word and says, no, you really did laugh about the promise that I have said. But here's the thought really of this journey in this story. Is that Abraham's recognition of God, Abraham's surrender to God, determined the preparations that he made for God and the expectations that he had on God. Abraham knew that it was God. He recognized that God had come to visit. He bowed to him. He displayed exemplary hospitality, and his expectation was met with an incredible promise and a miracle that would take place in his and Sarah's life. And so what does this story mean for us this evening? Well, you have come here on an ordinary night out of the routine of your week, the routine of your Sunday, but God has a different plan for you this evening. God is up on the hill and he's waiting to encounter you this evening. He's on the edge of the camp of your life this evening and he's got an expectation to encounter you and deposit a promise into your life this evening. See, the second thing is that we're here in our routine, but we worship and we surrender to him. And we've just sung worship together and we've displayed an act of worship to God. We've given our lives over to him. We've reminded ourselves how great he is and how small we are. And we've built a throne for him. We have worshiped him and recognized him. And now what we're going to do is begin to create room for him. Create a hospitable environment in our hearts for him to move in our lives. To say, God, I've come here this evening with no expectation, but I'm going to begin preparing for you. And you're going to have to be quick about this because I'm going to invite you to respond very, very soon. We're going to rush around like Abraham and prepare our hearts and say, God, I came in here with no expectation, but God, now I've readjusted my heart. I've made a hospitable environment for you, and I'm expectant of what you could do in my life this evening. Maybe you've come here this evening thinking, I'm ready to pray for other people, but God is saying, no, I've got something for you this evening. Maybe you've come here this evening feeling so distant from God. Well, God is here this evening ready to deposit something into your life and encounter you this evening. And so we're creating room for him, and then what we're going to do is we're going to stand and we're going to wait with expectancy for the supernatural and for the fulfillment of promises in our life. And so what we're going to do just now, before we invite you to respond, is we're going to stand and we're going to worship together. Because, I don't know, maybe this afternoon you've had a busy afternoon. Maybe you sang those songs like you've sung them before, just singing the words, doing the motions, going through it. But there wasn't that moment where you said, God, I really worship you. I really lift you above my life. I really honor you. I give worth to you this evening. So we're just going to give you an opportunity just to realign your heart and mind and truly worship God. And so whatever that means for you, whether you want to bow your knees, whether you want to raise your hands, whether you want to sing at the top of your voice, or however you want to worship right now, the band are going to lead us in a chorus and we're going to worship God. And as we worship, let's create room for God. Let's begin to say, God, what is it in my life that you want to do this evening? I want to create an expectancy for you. And then I'm going to lead us to respond this evening. So come on, let's stand together. Let's readjust our posture. Let's come in expectation this evening. Let's just remind ourselves that what God can do in this moment is limitless. He's above and beyond our expectations. He gives us more than we could ask or even imagine in our lives. And he can do what he can do in this moment is incredible. He's a supernatural God. So let's begin to readjust our hearts. The band will lead us just in a chorus just for a moment.